All right, so this is lecture week 6, the second and last part of this lecture, where we take up Professor Dolgoff's schema for examining a social welfare program. This is the framework. I'm essentially giving you the framework that you should use in organizing your final projects, your policy projects where you've selected a policy and/or a program, and you're asked to speak about the basic structural components of your chosen topic. So I'll give you the framework that we're looking for in your papers. So first, Professor Dolgoff notes that there are some basic structural components, or the main structural characteristics that you should be examining when looking at a particular policy or program. And so you'll want to say something about the needs and goals of the program with respect to your particular chosen policy or program. And then, of course, you'll need to talk about the benefit structure. You want to take note of the eligibility structure. And then, of course, you'll need to speak a little bit about the financing and the level of administration, whether it's federal or state administered. And then in the Dolgoff reading, he goes through a number of other alternate characteristics that you can also look at, but I've selected out 3 that I think are most relevant for our purposes. And so I'd like you to say a little bit about whether your program reflects residual thinking or institutional thinking. And then also another dimension, I'd like you to comment about the selective principles or maybe the universal principles that are contained with respect to your particular policy or program. And then finally, you'll want to say something about public or private affiliation. That's the last dimension that you should cover in your projects. Well, I didn't mention here some of the evaluative criteria, but I'll pick that up at the very end of this lecture. So first, in terms of the needs and goals to be met by your program. So certainly there's going to be some social issue. I had recommended to all of you that you think about some social issue that interests you, and you build your project around that social issue or problem. And so there might be some need in society that your program is intended to address. So it might be an issue of economic security, or maybe about healthcare or childcare that your program is intended to address. There might be a particular problem or social issue. That's the advice that I've given you all in terms of framing your topic. So there might be a need for a program to address issues like homelessness or child welfare, child maltreatment, about nutrition assistance and such. So most of you have built your projects around some social issue, but other programs are sort of above and beyond just simply addressing some sort of social issue, and it may be about enhancing quality of life. So there may be some sort of quality of life component, and so I'm thinking specifically about a program like Head Start, which has multiple dimensions. It's not just an educational program necessarily for people, for preschool age kids, but there might be a socialization component, there might be a recreational component to your program, so it might be more holistic in nature in terms of the needs and goals to be addressed by your program. Now, this is just a quick caveat in terms of discussing the goals and the needs or the objectives behind your program. So some programs are very clear in terms of the stated objectives. So you'll often notice some explicit objectives in the legislation. If you take a program like TANF, there are 4 stated purposes of TANF legislation designed to address poverty, designed to address the work effort, and around family structure. But make note that some programs, there might be some sort of unstated objective that's not really written into the legislation. So you want to read between the lines and make note of some of the unstated objectives behind your policy or program, quite possibly. So this is an argument that you'll make about some implicit objectives behind your program. So I'm thinking about nutrition assistance programs, and namely the food stamp program or supplemental nutrition assistance program, more formally stated. So certainly the stated objective or the explicit objective is to provide nutrition assistance to alleviate hunger and such. But some may argue that there are unstated objectives written into that someone may infer some unstated objectives from the legislation. So there might be some sort of social engineering going on that the government is trying to control people's behavior in the way of limiting what people can or can't buy. So for example, the prohibition on alcohol purchase or tobacco purchase, for example, might be considered an unstated objective. So make note of some of the unstated objectives for your chosen policy or program as well. The 2 following sections are about the benefit structure and the eligibility structure. So certainly you want to make note of the type of benefit that's offered by your program, and there's 2 different dimensions here. You'll want to say something about the actual nature of the benefit. Is the benefit offered in cash or in kind? We noted the distinction before in a previous lecture between cash assistance and in-kind assistance program, or maybe there's a hybrid type of benefit that's offered. Maybe there's near cash. So I'm thinking about food stamps. That might be considered near cash, or maybe health insurance. Right? That might be considered in-kind assistance. And then you'll want to say something about the level of the benefit. Do you think the level of the benefit is in fact adequate? You want to make note of that. If it's in the way of income support, is that benefit level, is that adequate? Or if it's in the way of counseling or services, is that service being offered, is it adequate to meet people's needs? You'll want to make a comment about that in your paper. And so I just give you some examples of different programs and the different types of benefits that are offered here. So I'm noting here unemployment insurance, certainly a cash assistance program that's temporarily offered for people who lose their jobs. In the case of a family social service agency, there might be individual or family counseling that's offered, or couples therapy that's offered. That's the form of the benefit that's offered by the agency. And then in the case of a housing project, they might be offering affordable, low-cost housing as the main form of the benefit. So just a few examples there. So the next dimension that you'll want to comment on is in terms of eligibility. So you'll want to think about the different pathways by which one attains eligibility into the program. What sort of risks of human existence are in fact covered? Right? In the way of social insurance programs, there are certain risks, certainly, that the program is designed to address against the risk of lost income on old age, or the loss or the risk of disability. Right? I'm of course thinking about social insurance, Social Security, and SSDI. But I have other examples here. So the SNAP program, certainly you have to meet federal poverty guidelines to be eligible for SNAP, for food stamp assistance. And then you might have community mental health services that are offered, and one may attain eligibility on the basis of residing in a particular jurisdiction or a particular area. You may need to live in a particular area to qualify for services from that agency. Other examples, Medicare, there's 3 different pathways primarily into Medicare eligibility on the basis of age, on the basis of disability if you've been receiving SSDI for at least 2 years, or you may also qualify based on catastrophic needs. So if you have end-stage kidney failure, you can also qualify for Medicare. So there's different eligibility requirements behind these different programs. Social Security, we know that you have to make contributions, 40 credits worth of contributions to qualify. Daycare, there may be certain age requirements, right, for your chosen policy or program. So your kids must be a certain age. A particular program or policy may require that your kids be a certain age. So these are all different examples of eligibility criteria for different policies or programs. A couple other dimensions in terms of the main structural characteristics that you'll want to discuss in your paper. You'll want to note the financing mechanism or the financing method for your chosen policy or program. And also, you'll want to note if it's publicly affiliated or privately affiliated. So first, in terms of financing, we've talked about all of these dimensions before. So think about the funding stream, right? Where does the funding come from? Where do the revenues come from? And how are those revenues being used? On the expenditure side, you want to note that funding stream, in other words. So we've talked about all these different approaches, many of these different approaches before. General revenue funding, dedicated or earmarked financing. You may have some sort of a payroll tax involved, right? In the way of social insurance programs, typically there's a tax assessed on both employers and employees. There might be some sort of payment by the recipient themselves. There might be some sort of block grant funding involved, or maybe a combination of any of these different mechanisms. So briefly, we've noted some of these before, but in the way of general revenue funding, just make note that this is something that doesn't necessarily apply just to government entities, but this is a term that might apply to private entities or nonprofit agencies. So a nonprofit agency may have some sort of general revenue funding stream in place. And when we talk about dedicated or earmarked funding or taxes, this is once again a term that not only applies to government entities, but also may apply to private for-profit and nonprofit entities. So let me give an example here. If you have an agency like the Alzheimer's Association, a nonprofit entity, and you have donors who call in, they want to make a donation to this agency. If the donation goes specifically towards research purposes, that might be an example of dedicated or earmarked financing, as opposed to where a donor makes a donation or a contribution that goes towards general local chapter services or to cover overhead and such. that might be considered an example of general revenue funding. So once again, note that these terms apply to nonprofit or private for-profit entities as well. So some further examples, we have payroll taxes. I noted that social insurance programs typically have some sort of payroll tax in place that's assessed against both the workers and the businesses. And then you have payment by the recipients themselves where people have the ability to pay. They may be required to make some sort of contribution to receive services. So we often refer to a payment on a sliding scale basis for nonprofit entities. Those who have a little more means or income, they may have to chip in a little bit to receive services. And then you have block grant funding. This is where basically the federal government provides a lump sum payment to the states, saying that they can use these funds to administer the programs however they see fit, however the state sees fit. And so your program may reflect this sort of block grant funding mechanism. And then, of course, the level of admin, you'll want to note whether your program is administered at the federal level, in other words, at the national level, or the state level. And so you have some national programs, examples of national programs. So certainly our social insurance, our big social insurance programs are national programs. They're national in scope. Social Security, Medicare are examples of federal programs. And then you may have programs that are administered more at the state level. So our TANF program is administered at the state level. Medicaid is administered at the state level. You want to distinguish between federal and state administration. And then some programs offer a balance of both. So note that in your Donald Lindhorst reading, where he talks about the new Federalist era, this is where more and more responsibility is devolved to the state level, to state governments in terms of administering programs. So you want to make note of this type of arrangement between federal and state governments, where states take on more responsibility for administering these programs. And then here, I want to make note about some alternate characteristics that you'll want to discuss in your paper. So you want to say something about whether or not your program reflects residualist thinking or institutionalist thinking. So the basic idea here is that some programs are thought to come in as a last resort. So when normal structures break down, so when private entities, when your family is no longer able to provide for itself, when churches and private entities are no longer able to provide for the poor, then government is expected to step in as a last resort. That's indicative of residualist thinking or residualist philosophy. So many of our public assistance programs reflect this type of thinking, that our public assistance programs should only step in as a last resort. Meanwhile, other programs reflect institutionalist thinking. And so note the term, you'll see the term institution in the word institutionalist type thinking. So these are those programs or policies that we've come to expect as a matter of right. They become institutions, in other words. And so if your program, for example, is, let's say, something like fire protection, police protection, or education, these are things that we've come to expect as a matter of right, and arguably maybe even Social Security we've come to expect as a matter of right. These would be examples of institutionalist thinking where the service in question is expected as a matter of right. It's become universal in our society, is a way to think about it. Another dimension that you'll want to comment on in your papers is whether your program reflects selective principles or universal principles. So there is certainly an alignment between residualist thinking and selective principles. If your program is designed around residualist thinking, then most likely you're going to have selective characteristics in your program. So there might be a means test if you're trying to weed out certain people and make sure that it's only offered as a last resort. So there's an alignment between residualist and selective principles. And then, of course, in terms of universalist thinking or universal principles, note that there's alignment between institutionalist thinking and universal principles. If you design a program around institutionalist thinking, then of course you're going to make your program available to as many people as possible, so it'll be universal in nature. Just one quick caveat here. So some programs may reflect both selective and universalist thinking. So the example that Professor Dolgoff gives is in the way of student loan programs. So federal student loan programs may reflect both. So it may be selective in the sense that they may check your income, they may check your assets, they may check your parents' income and assets to see if you qualify. But of course, one could also argue that it's universal in nature, that anyone who's a student who wants to attend school and you meet certain criteria, you're a US citizen and such, may qualify for that particular loan. So be wary of those programs that may reflect both selective and universal principles. And then, of course, you'll want to note whether your program or policy is, in fact, publicly affiliated. If there's any sort of interaction or extension of the government, we note that that's public in nature. And then, of course, if it's just a private entity, it could be private for-profit or private nonprofit. The best way to tell whether a private entity is in fact private for-profit or nonprofit is to think about how that entity was in fact incorporated. Is it a 501c3, in which case it's most likely a nonprofit entity? If it's, for example, a limited partnership, an LP, if it's a limited liability corporation, it's a private for-profit. So you want to think about that distinction between private for-profit and private nonprofit entities that Professor Dolgoff discusses. The more important distinction here is between public and private entities, but you'll want to make note also if there's a distinction between private for-profit and private nonprofit entities as well. And then finally, you'll want to say something in terms of the adequacy of your program. So this project is not an exercise in evaluating or analyzing really very deeply your chosen policy or project or program, but you'll want to note something about the adequacy of your program. So there's two different dimensions here, horizontal adequacy and vertical adequacy, that Professor Dolgoff notes in your reading. In terms of horizontal adequacy, this is an issue of reach. Is your program or policy, is it reaching its intended audience? That's a question you have to ask yourself. And in the way of vertical adequacy, this is not an issue of reach or coverage or the expansiveness of coverage, but more about the quality or the depth of services that are offered at your agency. And so you want to make note of both aspects of adequacy. One example is if we're talking about, once again, the Alzheimer's Association. And if you find that the agency offers services in 25 out of the 50 states, but they claim to be national in scope, then maybe you make a case that it's horizontally inadequate. In the way of vertical adequacy, maybe the agency only offers information, basic information over the phone and referral services. Maybe you make a case that that's vertically inadequate, so the depth of services that are offered is inadequate. Maybe you make a case that they could provide things like education, right, to people who are affected, maybe counseling services or support groups. They could do much more in the way of the services that are provided, so you make a case for the vertical inadequacy of the program. So just a very brief note, maybe one or two paragraphs I'd like in your papers commenting on both the horizontal and the vertical adequacy of your chosen policy or program. So this concludes the first half, actually, the first half of the semester. And then in the next half of the semester, the second module will pick up with discussion of very specific programs. So this is the sort of background that you'll need to write your policy projects.